Welcome to Making the Most Out of Your Grant Application. During this webinar, we'll be demystifying the grant application process. My name is Brandon Kennedy, and I have the honor of facilitating this workshop alongside my colleagues. Thank you everyone for joining in and participating in the chat. Now let's introduce your presenters for this webinar. Today you'll hear from Debbie Montenegro, NNLM Region 3 Deputy Director, Jen Ortiz, Consumer Health and Membership Coordinator, Marky Shepard, Community Health Engagement Coordinator, and I, Brandon Kennedy, the Health Information Strategist. You will have the opportunity to hear from the others later in the workshop. Before we get into our workshop today, here is a little history about the National Institutes of Health. The National Institutes of Health is the nation's leading medical research agency. Many of you might be more familiar with the National Cancer Institute, which is one of the many institutes and centers at NIH. The National Library of Medicine is the world's largest biomedical library, which maintains and makes available a vast print collection and produces electronic information resources like Medline Plus and PubMed. NNLM is a network of the National Library of Medicine and is an outreach program of NLM. The NNLM is made of 7 geographic regions, 3 national offices, and 3 national centers. We are from Region 3, which serves Arkansas, Louisiana, Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Texas, and our office is located at the University of North Texas Health Science Center at Fort Worth. At NNLM, our mission is to provide equal access to biomedical information to health professionals, as well as access to quality health information for the general public, so they are better able to make informed decisions about their health. We do this through resources on our website, funding of projects, webinars, and in-person trainings, just like this one. Over the next 2 hours, we will discuss grants available, including those from NNLM Region 3, explain the different sections of a grant application, identify documents to include with a grant proposal, describe elements of the budget proposal, and identify common mistakes made by proposal writers. To write a successful grant proposal, we need to identify the funding source for your project. This will give you the information you need to write your application. So I have a question for the audience. Where do you look for grant money? If you can share one resource, please do so in the chat. Thank you for sharing, and we are grateful that you are sharing these resources with us. So, with the resources that we go through, they are excellent, and we'll be elaborating some of them as we go. The first resource we would like to highlight is a network of National Library of Medicine. A membership in the network of the National Library of Medicine is completely free and easy to join. When you join, you will have access to funding opportunities, professional development, training, and more. If you have any questions on becoming a member, we can help you join our region or a region that's near you. Once you join our network, we will have access to our funding opportunities. Being a member allows you to sort through funding opportunities through different regions and to see national funding opportunities from programs like All of Us. Please make sure you select the region you're in to find funding opportunities that best fit you. If you are in Region 3, you can also see our funding opportunities and more on the Gibson D. Lewis Library page. Let's go ahead and take a look at our website. Our website on the Gibson D. Lewis Library page was created to be simple and easy to navigate. We have news, information about our office, open funding opportunities, how to join us for our monthly Health Bites webinar, which takes place on the second Tuesday of each month at 10 a.m. Central. And then just to plug it in February, we will also be discussing the reach and impact of period poverty, the inadequate access to menstrual hygiene products. You can also find our newsletters on this website and see a staff directory of all of the awesome individuals in our office. If you click on open funding opportunities, you will see what's available in our region. We have funding opportunities available throughout the year from various outreach awards, exhibit awards, and professional development awards. Our newest Health Information Outreach Award aims to provide support for projects that improve health information literacy and increase the ability of consumers, caregivers, students, and other members of the public to find access and use health information. Occasionally, reading grants can be confusing, so we want to eliminate any uncertainty when applying for grants. You should carefully read the announcement, and if there is any confusion in the application, please contact us. We want to make sure that you have a positive grant experience, so we are here to help. So if you have no idea what the language or the lingo of a grant means, it can be a little bit of a barrier. So if you don't already know the language, don't worry. There are free resources to help. NIH is a great place to locate funds, but it's also a great place full of free resources. If you're interested, NIH is also hosting a 2023 virtual grants conference starting tomorrow. It is free to sign up and may help solidify grants for you even further. You can visit this page at grants.nhi.gov. NHI has a free glossary and acronym guide that will help you understand just about any word that may pop up in a grant. I've used it myself personally. And some of the most common grant acronyms are RFPs, RFAs, CFAs, FOAs, PAs, LOIs, and letter of application. Now, I know I just said a whole bunch of things that you probably don't even know, or just a whole bunch of alphabet soup, but don't worry. If you don't know what these terms mean, no problem. We'll get into them on our next slide. Using the NIH glossary, let's describe some lingo that I covered before. So RFP, or request for proposal, announces that NIH would like to award a contract to a certain need. RFA, or request for application, is a formal statement that solicits grant or cooperative agreement applications in a well-identified and defined scientific area to accomplish program objectives. CFA is simple. It just means a call for applications. FOA, or funding opportunity announcements, is a publicly available document by which a federal agency makes known its intentions to award discretionary grants or cooperative agreements, usually as a result of competition for funds. PA, or program announcement, is a formal statement about a new or ongoing extramural activity or program. It may serve as a reminder of continuing interest in a research area, describe modification in an activity or program, and/or invite applications for grant support. LOI, or letter of intent, usually includes the name, address, and phone number of the private investigator and identifies other key personnel and participating institutions and the request for application or program announcement identification. Letter of application is essentially telling us why you want the grant and how it would benefit your project. So who are the funders? Now I know it is everyone's dream to receive that $1 million grant to make a change. But did you know that smaller grants can have just as much of an impact on the community you want to serve? When you start small, you gain the confidence and credibility you need to apply for larger grants in the future. Not sure where to start? Government funders are usually the best place to start your search. You may find federal, state, or local funding opportunities that fit your project goals. Grants.gov is an excellent resource for finding government funding. A few examples of government funding are the United States Department of Health and Human Services, National Institutes of Health, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, Health Resources and Services Administration, and the network of the National Libraries of Medicine, NNLM. You can also look for funding opportunities outside the government through various foundations. There are many types of foundations, each with different priorities and funding requirements. To give you an example, there are over 3,000 foundations in the Dallas-Fort Worth area that offer grant funding opportunities to the community. If you can't find a government grant that fits your needs, be sure to check your community foundations for potential funding opportunities. If you strike out on both government and foundation fundings, some professional associations may list funding opportunities on their website. Sometimes you have to be a member first, which can make the grant more exclusive and less competitive. So that's a little bit of a pro. But you can also find grants available through small businesses. The Small Businesses Administration connects entrepreneurs with funding to help plan and start their business goals. For university staff, there may be grants available within your institution that fit your needs. Universities often have subscriptions to databases to search for funders, for example, Pivot. So before we switch on where you can find grants, I have another question for the audience. Can you all think of any other types of funders than the ones listed above? If you can, please share some of the funders in the chat. Candid.org has a database where you can search for grants, but there is usually a cost for subscribing to the database. However, there are libraries, community foundations, and other nonprofit resource centers located across the United States. You can freely use candid.gov to go ahead and find them. Some of these locations are paying or have partnered with various foundations to offer access to grant databases for their patrons. Through candid.org, you can use a map to find network locations near you. Candid provides free funding opportunities for 400 funding information network locations. As a reminder, a membership to any public library is free, and libraries make excellent partners for community projects. The Grants.gov Program Management Office was established in 2002 as a part of the President's Management Agenda, managed by the Department of Health and Human Services. Grants.gov is an e-government initiative operating under the governance of the Office of Management and Budget. Today, the Grants.gov system houses information on over 1,000 grant programs and vets grant applications for federal grant-making agencies. The mission of the Institute of Museum and Library Services is to advance, support, and empower America's museums, libraries, and related organizations through grant-making, research, and policy development. As of 2023, they have awarded over $400 million in funding to multiple organizations. So when applying for government grants, here are some things you should remember. Government grants will always require an application. Always make sure you are on a government site and verify the grant availability before applying. Government agencies will never call, text, message you on social media or email to ask for your social security, bank account, or credit card information. In fact, no matter who they say they are, don't give out that information. Once a scammer has your information, they can steal money from your account or your identity. The only place you can find a list of all available federal grants is grants.gov, and that list is free. No government agency will ever contact you to demand that you pay to get a grant, and no government agency will ever ask you to pay with a gift card, cash reload card, by money transfer, or with cryptocurrency. Not for a grant and not ever.
Thanks, Brandon, for that great introduction to grants. So next, we will explore what to do when looking for funding and examine the different parts of a grant proposal application. So to get you thinking about funding and give us an understanding of where you are all coming from, we want to get an idea about what you think when you hear the words grant proposal. So if I say NNLM Region 3 has funding available and we are accepting grant proposals, what do you think about? So we'd like to hear what you think about and what these words mean to you. So go ahead and put those answers in the chat. And if you don't want to add your thoughts, just keep thinking about it as we go forward with the presentation. Your thoughts will help us so we know where you're coming from and your level of understanding of grants and proposals. Oh, I see some really great answers popping up in the chat. Yes, I really appreciate that. So Dee Dee says collaborations, and Rebecca, networking. Great ideas. I really appreciate that. This will really help us a lot as we go forward. So the point is, if you are feeling unsure or confused, or maybe you are a seasoned proposal writer, we want you to be better equipped to seek opportunities for funding. So when we talk about a grant proposal, it's all the things mentioned in the chat. So officially, it is a very clear, direct document written to a particular organization or a funding agency with the purpose of persuading the reviewers to provide you with support because you have an important and fully considered plan to advance a valuable cause, and you are a responsible and you're capable of realizing that plan. Most staff members in nonprofit organizations define a grant proposal as a request for money. And while that's true, that definition is only superficially correct. To achieve the best results for your community and the project focus group, nonprofits need to think of grants in a different way. So first, consider grants from a funder's point of view. For funders, a grant award is an investment in positive change. It's a tool they use for having an impact on issues that they care about. Next, consider grants from a mission-focused perspective. Since the point of a grant award is impact rather than money, the real point of a grant proposal is to rally the necessary resources to help a nonprofit fulfill its purpose. So a grant is another tool that nonprofits use to address important issues within their communities. And definitions do matter. So defining grant proposals accurately can help both funders and nonprofits work together more productively. So a grant proposal is really a call to action. So it's a request that a funder join a nonprofit as a partner in achieving specific results. So at its best, a grant proposal is a cogent, persuasive, and well-supported argument for change. So now that we know what a proposal is, there are a few things that you should consider before you start writing your grant proposal. So you will want to make sure that you, number one, prepare. You want to develop a specific, meaningful, actionable plan for what you want to do and why you want to do it. So you want to consider how your plan will achieve positive results. And next, you want to define your fundraising goals. So are you looking for 100% funding from a grant, or do you have some other sources of funding the project? Are there community partners out there with the same mission that you have that could provide some support in the way of funding a part of the proposal? So these are always good things to think about. And the third, you need to estimate your costs. So Debbie will be covering the budget later, but you should have a general idea of what the project will cost you to implement. And this will include costs such as materials, maybe labor or travel when coming up with that estimate. And you want to consider how you plan to sustain the project financially if this is a goal or objective. And you want to create a timeline. So this is going to really help you manage all activities from the pre-award phase through the award phase to the post-award wrap-up phase. So now you're ready to find prospective grants. Using the resources that Brandon mentioned, locate a granting organization or source that funds projects like the one that you have in mind. And you want to research for potential grants. And once you find one that fits, research that organization to make sure that its mission aligns with your plan. And you want to review the organization's proposal guidelines. And finally, you want to find some examples. So you can check out sample proposals that were successful in getting award from that institution or from actually your institution. And you can check with your peers or other organizations. These really will come in handy. So I really encourage you to use a checklist. It's a great way to get organized when starting a proposal process. So here's an example of a checklist for getting started, and this is found on the grants.gov website. So it's a list of steps to help you get started when applying for federal grants, but it can be adapted for any application process, so you might want to keep it handy. We've included a link to this in our resource guide if you're interested in using it. And no matter what you decide to use, I really do recommend that you have that checklist to help you keep track. For me, it's really something and really satisfying to check boxes off. I don't know about you guys, but I really like it. So I mentioned researching the funder a little bit earlier. However, there is a little bit more to grant researching than that. First, you need to know what you need. So before you even begin the grant researching process, it's a good idea to look at your organization first and determine what you need. So while you don't have to pay funds back with grants, most funders want you to tell them exactly how you plan to use their money and the specific ways you plan to spend it. As you get into fleshing out your research process, you'll need to know the answer to that question. And then you want to narrow down your list. Knowing what you need also helps you narrow down your list to grants that best fit your needs. Applying for grants can be a really long and sometimes tedious process, so it might be really appealing to have, dozens of grants to apply to, but you may want to have a short list or just a handful where you think you have a really good chance of getting funding. And then begin your search. So once you've completed these steps, 1 and 2, you can start your search in earnest. So with your funding needs and criteria set, you'll have a much easier time determining which grants should be added to your list or possibly even ignored. And keep in mind, this part of the process can take a while, so plan for it. So as you learn about funding, you might consider setting up a calendar on a biannual basis or maybe a quarterly basis so you don't miss any new grants throughout the year. So pay attention to those details. It may serve you really well in the end. And one last thing to remember, most grants have all sorts of qualifications and requirements. So both for applying and for spending the funds. So these aren't merely suggestions, but it's really an essential part of the grant process. So if you miss any of these, you may need to resubmit your proposals, or you could be disqualified entirely. So, do keep track of those specific requirements or qualifications that really stand out or are unique for specific grants. So here's some best practices for you to consider. Number one, keep track of everything. And I mentioned this earlier. So as soon as you start digging into the grant process, you're going to quickly learn that there's lots of dates, not to mention paperwork to keep an eye on. So your best bet is to develop some sort of system that allows you to keep track of important deadlines. Determine what will work the best for you, though. It could be a spreadsheet or maybe a calendar, or it could be a project management tool, but whatever it is, you want to make sure that you get everything on it. And then you might want to consider creating a grant library. You probably will be spending a lot of time researching opportunities, so don't let that newfound information go to waste. Compile everything you've learned in one place for future reference. It may come in handy. And as you talk to your friends or other people within the library world, you may be able to point them to something that may be beneficial to them in their project. And build a template for applications. So I can tell you, if there's one no you want to avoid, it's copying and pasting your entire grant proposal and submitting the same thing to all prospective funders. However, I want to point out that doesn't mean that there won't be elements or sections that you can essentially reuse with a bit of tweaking. But by creating a template grant proposal, you can build off that when you apply. So true story, I have seen applications where people have done this and they forget to go back and make corrections within the grant. And they may say you're applying for something from institution A, but they left institution B's name in there. So, this is why, it's really important to be careful. And you want to establish a network. So if your organization is looking at local or community grants, check in with some past winners, and applicants, ask them about their experience applying for grants. You might learn a variety of new tips and tricks that you might not have otherwise considered, and that can really help strengthen your application. And know your needs. So I mentioned this earlier, but it does deserve repeating. So look at your organization first. Know how much funding that you need, what you need it for, and how you plan to spend it. That can really help you immediately start the research with a much more targeted list of granting organizations in mind. And initiate contact. So if you have questions, don't ever hesitate to call up the funding organization and ask for clarification. They're often very happy to help. So those of us at Region 3 love to discuss project ideas, and so do other coordinators in the other 6 regions. So reach out. We love to award the funding. We don't want to leave any money on the table, and we like to serve as liaisons. And we want to see your project come to fruition. So please reach out and contact us. Bounce those ideas off of the coordinators and in our region, and we really will help you get this on the paper. All right, so you found the right organization for your needs. So you've done that planning, and now you're really ready to begin the steps for submitting the proposal. So now what? So one of the first steps you should take is to get familiar with the award you have decided to apply for. So the next section will be presented with NNLM grants in mind, but this information is typical for most grant applications. In the case of NNLM grants, this information can be found in the request for proposal, also known as the RFP. So within this document, you'll find all the information about the award and what you need to provide in the proposal to be awarded funding. So let's take a look at each section. So the first section in most awards is funding information. So here's where you're going to find important details about the award, such as the period of performance. So this lists the dates for the beginning and ending of the project performance period, or when you can start the project and when it needs to be wrapped up. The amount. This is where you can find the maximum amount of funding for the award. However, you can ask for less if your project fits the criteria. And the number of awards available. So sometimes there's multiple awards available versus just one. And the application deadline. Some applications have a really hard deadline, but some awards are ongoing, such as our professional development awards. So just make sure that you're aware of the deadline. The second section describes elements of the award, such as the mission of the funder. So this is where you'll learn all about the funder. And this may include the mission, vision, and information about the goals and objectives the funder has for the work they do. And Brandon mentioned the NNLM goals, but I'm going to reiterate them just to put them in your mind. So the main goals for NNLM are to work through libraries and other members to support a highly trained workforce for biomedical and health information resources and data, improve health literacy, and increase health equity through information. So I suggest taking a deeper look at any organization that you're thinking of submitting proposals to. So it's really important to make sure that the mission, vision, and goals of an organization align with your organization's. So this is especially important if you need to gain support of a board or administration before applying for a specific award. Primary aims of the award. So in this section, you'll find out if the project you have in mind aligns with the aims of the organization, so of the award. So for instance, the primary aims of awards offered by NNLM regional medical libraries are to widen access to and awareness of health information resources with the focus on those resources provided by NLM. So just make sure that your project does fit those aims. And the purpose of the award. Oh, okay, so in this section, we get down to it. This provides the reason the award is being offered. So the Health Information Outreach Award offered by Region 3 for the coming year provides support for projects that improve health information literacy and increase the ability of consumers, caregivers, students, and other members of the public to find and use health information. So bear in mind, this can cover a wide range of potential projects. So be creative. And this is when I want to encourage you to reach out to us at Region 3 and see if that creative project could fit the purpose of this award. So all applications provide information about what is required when submitting a proposal. So take a close look at what is needed and make sure you address the requirements in the proposal. So for instance, NNLM awards require one or more NLM resources to be included in the project. So this can be the use of materials found in NLM resources for teaching purposes, or to build toolkits, or to impart health information. And preferences refers to what the funder will be looking for when reviewing the proposal. So this usually refers to increasing information access, prioritizing underrepresented populations, geographic locations that are typically underserved, and other demographics that contribute to unequal access to health information. So some RFPs include project ideas. These could be based on previously funded projects and are ideas to help you finalize your idea. So a good place to look is the previously funded project section on the nnlm.gov website. Determining whether you're eligible to apply for and receive a federal grant, or any grant for that matter, is really important. So if you're not legally eligible for a specific funding opportunity, you would really waste a lot of time and money completing the application process when you can't receive the grant. So in the case of NNLM grants, the organization must be a network member and be in the region offering the funding. The exception is the All of Us funding opportunities that are promoted throughout all 7 regions. Regarding projects that conduct research, some regions may require special documentation if research is going to take place. And NNLM grants do not apply to research using human subjects. So make sure your organization fits the eligibility requirements by reading this section. So to recap, here are a few do's and don'ts to think about. Do your research. Do read the entire request for proposal. do create a timeline, and do reach out to the funder. And above all, don't give up. So beyond the application overview, NNLM grants provide a section called Additional Information. Here you can find grant writing resources, 508 compliance requirements, which we will discuss later on, reporting requirements throughout the funding cycle, and how the proposal is scored. So now I'm going to pass this over to Jen, who will take you through the application overview.
Thank you very much. So occasionally reading grants can be confusing. And so we want to eliminate any uncertainty when applying for our grants. So as Margie mentioned, you should carefully read the announcement. And if you have any questions about what information we're asking for or how to answer one of those questions, please get in touch with us. We want to ensure that you have an excellent grant application experience, and we are here to help. So here, I'm going to assume that you've researched all the grants available and you've found one that's perfect for you or your team to apply for. And so make sure you read over that entire request and see what's required of you. So depending on your organization, you may need to speak to other departments to get certain information or approval, and it could take a while. So even if you were a pro at pulling all-nighters in college and turning in those papers right in the nick of time, you're not going to be able to do that with most grant applications, and specifically with the federal applications, you're not going to be able to do that. So on this slide, you'll see all of the items required for one of our grants. So in this section, I'm going to assume that you're located in Region 3, you've seen one of our outreach grants, and you've decided, okay, that's what I want to apply for. And so that's what I'm going to walk you through here. So you're going to want to gather all of these documents together so that you can send them in one email. And you'll notice that some of these say they're optional or if applicable. So take a look at these to see if you'll need them for your application. And I'll go over these in more detail on the following slides. And of course, as we mentioned, budgets are an important part of the process, and my colleague Debbie will speak more on that later in the presentation. So I'm going to skip over numbers 4 and 5. And I'll also briefly mention number 6, the IRB determination letter, which Margie also briefly mentioned. And so the RML or NNLM does not fund projects that involve human subjects research. Some organizations, such as academic libraries, may have an institutional review board or IRB, and they can generate a determination letter that shows that your project does not meet those regulatory definitions. And inquire within your organization if you're unsure. And I know it's highly likely that you work with an organization that doesn't have a review board. So please reach out to us if there are any concerns that your project could potentially be considered human subjects research. And that way we can work with you before you apply to ensure that your project would be fundable. And so now we're going to start with the full project proposal and what that consists of, specifically for our outreach projects. And the first page is project information. And so this is just one page that gives us the basic information of that proposal. Essentially, it's the cover sheet for your proposal. We're going to ask for the lead organization. And while several organizations may be working together on this grant, our office will be contracting with one organization that will be responsible for submitting invoices and being reimbursed. And so Debbie will cover that in more detail, but we want to know which organization will be the lead. And this organization needs to be an NNLM member organization. And as it was mentioned earlier in the presentation, I, Jen Ortiz, am the Consumer Health and Membership Coordinator. So if you have any questions about whether your organization is a member or you need to update any information, please reach out to me. And then we also want to know who the project lead is. So again, several people may be working together to write this proposal. And I do highly suggest that you gather a team to do this. But we want the name of one contact person, especially if we have questions or we need to speak with you about making possible changes to make the grant fundable. We'll also need the tax ID of your organization and the institution unique entity identifier. Beginning in April 2022, the government transitioned from the DUNS number to a unique entity identifier created in sam.gov. So you'll want to reach out to the person in your organization who would be responsible for creating this. And it could take some time to identify that correct person and make sure that this has already been created for your organization. So I highly suggest you start working on this now. We'll also ask if your institution applied for funding in the current grant cycle, which began on May 1st, 2021. If you're not sure, again, contact us and we can let you know. And the final thing that we want on the first page is the total amount you are requesting. We have grants for several different amounts, and if you only need $24,999 instead of the full $25,000 for a grant, this is where you'd let us know. This should also match what is on the budget sheet that you include. And make sure that the amount you are requesting does not exceed the amount available for that particular grant you are applying for. As I mentioned, we have several different outreach awards, and so you want to make sure you're applying for the one that matches the budget that you need. Okay. And so the first thing on our list is the project information and narrative section. And so your proposal will have that cover sheet with the name of the project. And this is how we refer to your project during the year that you're funded, and it will be how it's presented on our website. So we mentioned that you can look at past funded projects on our site. So whatever you name it when you apply, that's how it will be referred to in the future. So think of your project proposal as a book manuscript, and the project title will be the book title. Consider keeping it short because you're going to be typing it quite a bit, but also keep it descriptive, especially if you're applying for multiple awards with different organizations. Keeping it descriptive will let you know which particular project you're working with. And we also want a project summary. So in just a few paragraphs, give us a concise description of your plan. You'll also list any partner organizations working with you, whether you'll provide training to anyone, and their proposed start and end dates. Make sure the dates of the project fall within the dates listed on the call for proposals. For example, all of our grants for year 3, which is what we're talking about now, will need to be completed by April 30th, 2024. So even if it's a project that you think could go longer than that, we can only fund projects, we can only fund the part of the project that would be completed by April 30th, 2024. Okay. And then now, what I think is the most interesting part of the application, which is the full narrative. So the narrative is where you tell us the story of what you want to do, why it's important, and how you will measure the impact of your project. And so remember, this will be read by people who aren't familiar with your community or your organization. Make sure to not use any jargon or acronyms that would be unfamiliar to people outside your organization. NNLM staff have diverse backgrounds, so you want to provide details. If in doubt, give more information. But be aware that we have a 10-page limit for the narrative, exclusive of an appendix or bibliography. If you give statistics on your community, such as demographic information, please provide the sources. We want to know why you feel that this project is needed for your community. And you'll want to tell us your project goals and objectives. And you'll want to make sure that these goals line up with the purpose of the grant that you are applying for. And again, for example, our grants provide support for projects that improve health information literacy and increase the ability of people to find, access, and use health information. So make sure you're specifically letting us know how your project does that when you apply for it. And then what are you going to do to meet these objectives? What are the major tasks and who's going to be responsible for them? And you want to include a schedule or a timeline for implementing your plan. And be realistic in your estimate. We want you to be successful and not stressed to complete tasks quickly or to complete more tasks than are actually necessary for the project. Our projects only run for a few months, so we'd rather you focus on doing a few things well rather than doing many things with a lack of focus. And also think, how will you know if your project is successful? You're going to need some sort of evaluation plan. Are you counting attendance, completing surveys, etc.? What is the goal of your project and how are you going to measure it? If funded, you'll need to discuss the success of the project and what could have been improved and changed as you fill out reports throughout the time period. And so you're going to want to think this through before you begin the project so you'll know what success is. And you can consider a logic model to determine your goals and the actions you'll need to take to accomplish them. If you're not familiar with logic models, check out the grant writing resources document, where we've linked to some evaluation resources from the NNLM, including a tier list logic model that will walk you through the process. A link to that will be placed in the chat. And then also think, how will your community, especially your target audience, know what you're doing? How are you promoting to your target audience? Will you be using social media, flyers, TV ads, word of mouth? You don't want to put effort into a project that no one attends. So if your project is targeting people with low technology skills or an area of your state that doesn't have high-speed internet, then an online campaign is probably not the best use of your time or resources. And this is also the section where you're going to want to specifically mention the NNLM resources that you plan to use in the project. So remember, we are an outreach arm of the NNLM, the NNLM is an outreach arm of the NLM. And so we want to fund projects that are using NLM resources. So make sure you're letting us know what those resources are as you apply, fill out the application. And then, will this project be ongoing? So if so, how will it be staffed or funded? Are you creating materials or purchasing supplies that can continue to be used after the grant period is finished? Because we do love projects that will extend past those few months, but we want to know, how will you be able to do that once the funding has stopped? And then the last section discusses the personnel qualifications. So you're going to mention all the staff involved in the project, both from your organization and any other partner organizations, and describe their roles and experience. If you're from an academic institution, you may have pages-long CVs for each of your staff. You may also have a staff person who's been with your organization so long that they don't have an up-to-date resume, or maybe you're relying on a long-term volunteer for part of this project. Have them create a brief resume showing their history with your organization and show how their experience fits in with the roles they'll be taking on in this project. And just remember, this doesn't need to be fancy, but we do need it as part of the application. And as you're writing your narrative, you're telling the reviewers what you plan to accomplish with this project. You'll want to keep in mind that for most awards, including those from the NNLM, you'll be asked to write reports detailing the actions you took on your project and how successful you were. And again, that means that now is the time to determine what success means to you. Will that be the number of participants attending a class, a percentage increase in knowledge with pre and post surveys, or something else? This depends on the type of project you're undertaking, but you need to figure out now what you'll need to measure and how you'll do that. And if you listed other organizations that you'll be partnering with, see if you can get someone from that organization to write a letter of support. If they've worked with you on previous projects or are familiar with your work, this is helpful to mention. If they describe what they'll be doing in the project, it's clear that they're up for the challenge if the grant is awarded. Even if they haven't worked with you before, a letter sharing their enthusiasm for the project can go a long way. I've seen applications that relied heavily on other organizations. Perhaps they were providing the event space, or they had the students or staff that were being reached in the projects. And a few times I've wondered if those organizations knew they were actually even included in these proposals because there was no feedback from them. And then it's been mentioned before, but it's so important that I'm going to mention again, have someone else read over your proposal before you send it in. Make sure that names are spelled correctly and that you've used the correct names. Any acronyms are spelled out and any statistics are cited. Try to have someone outside of your department or your organization read it to see if they're confused by anything. If they have questions, the reviewers probably will too. Okay. And as I start to finish up, I want to leave you with a few tips and tricks. Begin early. Something will take longer than you thought, or something will come up at work and you won't have the time you plan to finish. And apply often. It's a time-consuming process, but it's a numbers game. The more often you apply, the more likely you are to be awarded. And then once you've done the research and you've pulled the demographics of your community and you found the needs of what you want to do, you can use that information for many different applications. And remember, don't forget to include the cover letter that summarizes your application, and answer all questions and any that you think others might come up with based on your proposal. There shouldn't be any surprises in the application, especially between the budget and the narrative. So if we've been reading about an in-person program and then we see $10,000 in the budget for laptops with no mention of what they'll be used for, that can be confusing. And also be explicit and specific. Asking for $20,000 for a telehealth kiosk doesn't tell us what you're trying to purchase. Is it a pre-made kiosk with all of the technology supplied? Or are you purchasing computers, webcams, medical equipment separately and then making your own kiosk? Give us specifics. If you have a link to a particular item you're planning to buy or thinking about buying, that can be helpful. And you don't need to commit to buying that specific item, but it gives us an idea of what you're planning. Because remember, you know this project, but all we know about it is what we're reading in your application. So we really need you to be specific. And then finally, a few more tips and tricks. So first, make sure to follow application guidelines exactly. You may have an excellent project that the funders would love to see come to fruition, but you haven't followed the guidelines and they're either unable to review your full proposal or they're concerned that you wouldn't follow other guidelines, such as budgeting and reporting procedures if you were to get funded. And if you have any questions about these guidelines or what to do, again, reach out to us before the deadline and we can help. And again, be specific. We often read narratives that seem to skip over many of the details. And if you've been dreaming of this project for months, these things may seem obvious, but the reviewers have no previous knowledge, so we need all of those details listed. That's another reason why it's important to have someone who doesn't know as much about the project review your application. They may notice that something is missing and allow you to fill in those gaps before it comes to us to read. And be realistic. It's easy to become ambitious and try to change the world, but it's much more impactful to determine what you and your organization can take on and succeed at. A small project can be more helpful to your community than a large one with many moving parts. So just as Brandon mentioned, while we all want the $1 million funding and we want to do these big projects, sometimes it's helpful to start small, see what you can accomplish, and then move on to larger projects. And finally, continue applying for funding. If you apply for one of our grants, even if you're not funded, we'll provide you with extensive feedback to make your application more competitive in the next cycle. We love to see applicants who have reworked their project and applied again. And you've now heard enough from me, so I'm going to pass it over to Brandon.
Thank you, Jen. I think this would be a great time to reflect on what we have learned. So far, we have discussed grants available from different trustworthy institutions, how to apply for funding through the network of the National Library of Medicine, different sections of our grant application, and identified what documents to include in your grant proposal. Let's use the next 5 minutes to get a snack, use the restroom, and answer any lingering emails. We'll be back at 11 a.m. to cover the elements of your budget proposal and identifying common mistakes made by proposal writers.
All right, welcome back everyone, and welcome to the Grant Budgets Primer portion of this presentation. Hopefully today you'll take away some knowledge to give you the confidence to approach this important part of the application process. So let's take a look at some of the things that we will tackle today. Next slide, please. Thank you. Budget terminology. What are some of the common words, acronyms, and phrases that we will encounter in budget applications? The budget narrative, telling the written story of your budget, and also some common categories. We'll also build a very simple example budget just so you can see some of the different categories. And then we'll just cover some things to consider, things that are items that we hope that you will walk away with. Next slide, please. All right, so far there have been several acronyms and keywords that we've talked about throughout this presentation, that many of which you may or may not have heard before. Some of these terms can be used interchangeably and can often vary between institutions. And so the word cloud here, it's a little bit small, but you can see some of the words on there, like benefit, in kind, allocable, allowable. We'll be covering some of these words. the grant world has specific definitions for some of these terms. So that's what we will be going over. But just so you all know, these, some of these definitions might vary. Some of the terms might vary across institutions. So it's important to make sure that you familiarize yourself with the terminology associated within that funding opportunity. So what I like to say is, use the terminology that the funder uses. So whatever their funding opportunity announcement says, whatever wording they use in that, go ahead and match those terms. So if the funding opportunity mentions something like, health literacy, then, use terminology surrounding health literacy. When going through the requirements for a funding opportunity, and you find an acronym or a word that you are not familiar with, there's a couple of things you can do. You can do a search for some of the meanings, or you can contact the funder for them to further clarify what they mean by the funding opportunity. It can be really helpful to search for the term and do a search query and add grants to the end of it to signify that you're looking for specifically a grant term. And then often you'll find that there will be resources available as well from the funder or general funding website. Some of y'all dropped in the chat earlier some really good resources for grants for finding funding opportunities. And of course, if any of that doesn't work, when in doubt, reach out to the funder. And generally the funder will be able to help you figure out what they mean by whatever terminology they may be using. So with that being said, let's move on to some basic terminology that is pretty essential for starting the budget development process. So the first phrase we have, this isn't so much a word as it is a phrase, which is scope of work. So for this, NIH's definition describes it pretty well. Simply put, the scope of work is the overview of the aims, objectives, and purposes of a grant. So this comes first because to properly develop your program, it's critical to consider how each of the funds requested to support the project will contribute to the overall goals and expected outcomes of your program or project. So how does the work that's being done on this grant or this award, how does it fit into the aims or objectives or the end goal that the funder is hoping to see? So something I've mentioned in the past before is that you want to make sure, even if you have a really great project idea, you also want to make sure that it's a good fit for the funding opportunity. So I often recommend looking at several different funding opportunities if you have a specific project in mind and matching it to the funder that would fit the best. So it's a bit of a matching mechanism. So it's always important to have that end game in mind and kind of match those end goals across. So knowing your project and the outcomes can help you be able to more clearly communicate, what the grant's impact would be and the progress of your project when the funder would ask how things are going whenever you are awarded. So the funder wants to be sure that their funding, in this case, well, for our case, our funding is funded by the NIH, but essentially, if you dig all the way into it, it's taxpayer funded money, right? So we want to make sure that it's being put to good use and has a good outcome. So we want to make sure that the scope of work is very clear and that the scope of work is being met. If there is a program or a project where the project lead doesn't think they're able to meet those aims, and they would need to bring that up to the funder's attention. So usually after being awarded, the scope of work is essentially what you're trying to follow along with. A change in the scope of work after being after being awarded would require approval. And so a change in the scope of work could be a change in the population, a change in the overall outcome, a change in personnel. And so that's actually happened maybe a little more frequently in the past, where, especially during COVID times, where there was just a turnover of staff. And so that would be considered a pretty huge scope of the project, because in some cases, for some projects, the project isn't able to continue with those specific people who were attached to it. So that's a pretty big change. So it's crucial to know that your project, there's the scope of work for your project. And if you are uncertain about scope of work or changes to scope of work and things like that, you can always reach out to us or to the funder. But an example of fitting to the scope of work, and this is perhaps a slightly different example, is, and we'll look into this a little more closely later, which is the budget categories, but I'm just going to pick a category. Travel comes up a lot as a question. If travel support is being requested, there needs to be a benefit of the travel for the project. So how does this travel fit into the overall scope of the work being done on the project? And so they will need a justification, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But if it's not part of the scope of work, or if it doesn't fit the scope of work, then travel would not be an appropriate category to request for the project if it's not needed for that program. But we'll cover a little more about that in following slides. All right, so the next definition will be for cost principles. So in the case of federal funding, awardees are required to have solid management practices for administering the award and have accounting practices that align with cost principles. Well, what is a cost principle? Cost principles specify that a cost can be charged to a federal award only if it is allowable, reasonable, and allocable. In addition, items of cost must be treated consistently by the award recipient. And so the next question is, well, what do those words mean? So now we're going to dive in deeper about what each of those words mean. Allocable means that we are only charging a proportionate amount to the grant that matches up with the ratio of the work being done. And this is easier to describe when we're talking about personnel. If personnel on the grant expect to dedicate 50% of their 40-hour work week to a grant, say for a year, they should only request that proportionate amount of salary support. So it would be 50% of their salary for that year is what they would request on the grant. And this concept also applies to other aspects of items being purchased for the grant as well. And let's see here. Yes, next slide. I was thinking a little bit about expanding on that, but we actually have a few slides in a little bit that will expand on that. So next definition is allowable. This is likely one of the more difficult concepts because this can vary from grant to grant and funder to funder. And so this one, it basically depends on the policies of your funder. For us, we go by the federal standards because we are ultimately funded by the National Library of Medicine, which is part of the NIH. And so there's a larger NIH grant policy that we go by. And so we usually go by those federal standards. It's very important to familiarize yourself at least with what is listed in the RFP or the request for proposals, or what you might call the funding opportunity announcement. Again, there's several different names for those. And so for an example, our RFP does have a statement, some parameters, and it says, for an example, it says food, promotional items, and furniture are not allowable expenses. And then there's a list of some examples of what those might be. And then there's a link to the overall greater NIH grants policy. And some example of some more specific examples would be, at least for our grants, is promotional items include but are not limited to clothing and commemorative items such as pens, mugs, cups, folios, lanyards, and conference bags that are sometimes provided to visitors, employees, grantees, or conference attendees. So sometimes it can get pretty specific. But again, if you have any particular questions about what is or isn't allowable, feel free to contact us. A general thought that I go by, but again, always contact us because it depends, is that things that are essentially giveaways or consumables aren't necessarily fundable with our type of funding. But again, you can always reach out to us and double check with us if something would be allowable or not, because again, this one is a little more tricky. But as always, we generally tend to go by the NIH grants policy. All right, so next up is some examples of unallowable costs. So again, as we were just talking about, it can be a little bit difficult to decide what is or isn't allowable. So here's just some examples of what are not allowable. So cost of entertainment would be considered unallowable. An example of that is, if someone is taking on a project and they're using these, taxpayer funds, the last thing people want is for someone to pay to take their team out to the movies and throw a party with catering, right? That wouldn't necessarily be considered a good use of that that funding. A better use might be, the creation of health information resources, or somehow being able to institute the access to resources of those information resources. Of course, personal expenses, we can't, if you've ever had like a company card or something like that, you're not supposed to pay for your personal groceries using the company card. So it's kind of similar rules apply to the grants. Alcoholic beverages, membership dues, some other kind of specific items such as that. And I think most would understand some of the reasons behind those. And then there are some costs that can be included in FNA. We'll talk about FNA a little bit later. And so those are just some examples. There are some exceptions, and I will say there is an exception for food. This one can be highly confusing, but it can be allowed if, say, you have a staff member traveling for purposes of the grant project and they need to get reimbursed for meals while they're traveling for work. And so, for an example, if one of our staff goes on a trip, our university will allow us to use a per diem, and we base the per diem amount on the government rates. And those are called GSA rates. And I think I have that on the next slide. And so if you go to the gsa.gov, they will show you the rates for different locations. And so we tend to go by that listing. I think that's probably a good list of unallowable costs. But if you have questions about what is or isn't allowable, again, this is a slightly trickier one to dive into. So you can always feel free to reach out to us and cover some of those things. I think I have a little listing here of some other items that may not be allowable. And it's bar charges, tips, personal telephone calls, laundry charges. So they can get pretty detailed on what is or isn't allowed. Next slide, please. All right. Apologies, I need to find my place once more. All right. So reasonable costs are our next definition. So, oh, sorry, there's a question in the chat. Yes, consultants and contractors can be allowable, and I will mention them briefly in a little bit. So reasonable costs are just what it says on the tin. These are very straightforward. Simply put, the amount requested cannot be excessively high, and it should be within the bounds of common sense. So many will reference what's called the prudent person test, which is, I think, more of a law terminology, actually. But basically what that means is, what would the reasonable or prudent person do? So would a prudent person pay this particular amount for the same item or service? If this is a news article that popped up on your phone, would you be okay with that purchase? What the amount of the purchase? And this can also be a little tricky, but what some people will do, and some funders will request this depending on the funder, is they will ask for either quotes, a certain number of quotes, or maybe historical records of prices that have been paid previously, or wages in the case of personnel, what have people been paid in the past. If you have needed to contract out the printing of pamphlets or something like that, do you have a couple of quotes of different vendors that would do that and how much it would cost to do that? So depending on the funder, they may or may not ask for, backup quotes or historical records or something like that. But essentially what they're trying to get at is they're trying to make sure that, the money is being spent well, and we're not sprinting for the most expensive package, right? It needs to be a reasonable cost, and that can be backed up by things like quotes or historical records. So I know people have asked me, it's like, well, how do you know if it's reasonable? So, getting quotes and things like that, you can kind of get like an average of what something may cost. All right, next. Sorry, I'm also trying to check the chat. What about water, snacks for educational session? So again, generally for this grant, food isn't necessarily allowable. However, we do have IDC, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So again, I feel like the answer most of the time is it depends. And so I will elaborate on that a little bit in a few slides. All right, so direct costs are easily identified. They are your people, your salaries, your wages, direct materials and supplies, can be consultants and subcontracts to contractors. So those would all be considered direct costs. And contractors can be used. However, you would need to make sure that there is a proper justification. And it would be more responsibility on your end to have a contractor. I'm expanding on this a little bit because I know someone asked about it earlier. You would be responsible essentially for their invoicing you and repaying them. So our awards are on a cost reimbursement basis. So being a cost reimbursement basis, that means that you would need to be able to cover or work with that contractor and then be paid back by the award. So yes, you can hire on a consultant or a contractor, but just know that there will be extra steps for you if you do have some outside help. And so it's neither good nor bad. It's just a different way of doing parts of the project. All right, so indirect costs. So there's direct costs and there are indirect costs. Again, direct costs are just very easily identified. You know that you're going to have so many people in the grant, personnel, materials, things like that. Indirect costs is an actual subcategory or budget category in itself. And in the grants world, it gets thrown around a lot. It has different names. And so you might hear indirect costs referred to as its acronym, which is IDC. So if you hear me say IDC from here on out, what I'm referencing is indirect costs. So an indirect cost is something that's not easily charged to one project, but is necessary for the institution to operate. So we're talking like, there's several different departments at a university, and everyone needs electricity. Everyone needs garbage taken out. Everyone needs some general supplies. Where's my stapler? That sort of thing. So there isn't necessarily a direct way to figure out how much of the electricity bill just your office is using for at the university. Maybe you're able to do that, but it's not so easy to do that. And so instead, what some institutions will do is that they will have a negotiated rate with the government for an IDC amount. And so what this means is whatever you are requesting for your project in direct cost, you are allowed to ask for an amount, a percent amount of that cost. Now, what's a little bit interesting is that rate will depend specifically on your institution and whether or not they've negotiated that rate with the government. So if you're at a university, chances are you already have set IDC rates. You might even have multiple rates depending on the type of project that you're doing. So a research project might have a higher IDC rate than, say, like a regular educational project. And those rates can really vary depending on the institution. So I've seen rates varying between like 20%, 30%, 40%, maybe even 50%, depending on the type of project, whether it's research or education. And so if you do not have a negotiated rate, there is something that's called the de minimis rate. And all that really means is that if you don't have a negotiated rate, then you can use 10% as your IDC rate. And so again, if you don't have one, you can use the 10%. So I'm going to backtrack and make sure I covered all of that. Yes, so IDC are costs that you cannot easily charge. And these are those like additional costs like electricity and things like that. And so what you can do is you can look up your, asking your institution, do we have a negotiated rate, and find out what those rates are. Most institutions and academic places will have a whole sheet with the different rates listed. So you can request that. And then if you don't have one, then you can potentially use the de minimis rate, which is just 10%. All right. So here's an example of IDC calculations, because I know it can be a little bit confusing. So again, the percent rate will depend on your organization and whether they have a negotiated rate or not. I'm going to do an example basing off of, just for an example, this institution does not have a set rate, so we're going to do the 10%. Okay, so some funders will allow IDC, some funders will not allow IDC. Some funders will allow you to go over the total amount of the award, including IDC, and some will not allow you to go over. And so to kind of put that into numbers, I'll give you an example of how our funding works. So our funding, the total amount when you add your direct costs and your IDC amount has to equal up to the award amount, but not over it. So say if we were applying to an award of $10,000, $10,000 being the total cost that can be awarded, we could request a 10% rate with $9,000 in direct costs. And the reason why I say that is because if you take $9,000 in direct cost, 10% of that would be $900. When you add 9,000 to 900, you would get $9,900 as your award total that you are requesting. Because when you're requesting your amount, you're requesting both the IDC amount and the direct cost together. The total is the combination of those two. But because that combination cannot be greater than 10,000, that's what we're doing is having the 9,000 with the 900 IDC, so we can come in at less than 10,000. Now, if you wanted to, you could work with a budget and kind of shift it around a little bit to utilize as much of the budget as possible and get as close as you can to the total 10,000. You can do that, but you just can't go over the 10,000. So if you wanted to, we could raise that 9,000 up just enough to get the IDC and the direct cost to total up to closer to 10,000. You can do that. But again, the emphasis of this little example is just to show that the totals of the IDC and the direct costs, when combined, should only equal up to or less than the total amount of the award. So again, this really varies by funder. And so I'm just emphasizing how our funding would accept it. But again, always double check with funding opportunities because again, some funders will allow it, but they will only allow you to go up to the total amount, but not over. Some will allow you to go over with IDC. Some won't allow IDC at all. I think that's all the slides I had for IDC, but one more thing I wanted to mention about IDC is that IDC can often be used for items that might not be necessarily on the rest of your budget category. So someone asked about water and snacks earlier. Depending if your organization allows your department to utilize your IDC or not, or a percentage of it, if you are allowed to use that IDC, you could potentially use some of that IDC to pay for things that are not necessarily direct costs. So if you want to do like water and snacks and things like that, you could use that 10% IDC or whatever your set rate of IDC is. However, that's up to your institution. So some institutions will take the IDC and it goes to your organization. It doesn't go to your department necessarily. So if IDC is something you're looking towards to use for some other items, you would need to investigate with your organization and see how they distribute IDC. For a lot of academic institutions, it also really varies. I know some institutions where the department will get the full amount of the IDC directly, and there's other departments where they don't get any of it. And I think more than likely, some departments will get a percentage of it. So you might get 20% of the IDC that's requested, and the rest of it goes to your organization or institution. So depending on how your organization runs that, can determine whether or not you can use that IDC amounts. So that's just an extra, I'm just throwing that tip in just because someone had asked about like snacks earlier. All right, and I'll just final few notes on IDC. So I can go on and on about IDC, but I'll try to wrap it up so I can get to the next section. IDC can also be called a couple different things. It could be called FNA, which stands for Facilities and Administration. It can be referred to as MNO, which stands for Materials and Operations. It can also be called Overhead or Discretionary Funds. So if you hear any of those terms, FNA, MNO, Discretionary Funds, Overhead, likely they all mean IDC, which is the indirect costs. Okay. All right, sorry, I can go on about that, but I will stop there and I will go on to the next section, which is the budget narrative. All right, so the budget narrative is where you get to explain in words what you need and why you need it, which is slightly different than what the budget is. Next slide, please. All right, so the budget and the budget narrative are both required, and they're technically two different things. The budget narrative is the written portion where you explain exactly what it is and why you need it. And it exists alongside your numbers-based budget, which is generally in a spreadsheet. So the spreadsheet with all of the numbers and rows and everything like that, where you add up the numbers, that's what we consider the budget. The budget narrative will be a separate written document where you essentially justify all of the things that are in the budget and explain why those things are needed and what are the things that you're getting in a little bit more detail. So in your budget spreadsheet, you might have a line that says like materials, $500. And we'll get into this a little bit, but the narrative is where you'll explain what those materials are and why you need those materials for the project. So essentially, these are two companion documents. You have your numbers budget and then you have your budget narrative. So in this picture, we have just general common budget categories. Like we talked about earlier, we have salaries and wages, equipment, materials, things like that. And so I will go into a little bit more detail about each of these little common budget categories. and kind of describe a little bit about the narration part of it as well. So if we can go to the next slide. All right, so first off, we'll start with salaries and wages. So of course, in order to run a project, you'll generally need some people to see it through and work on it. So once you have people assigned to roles, an idea of expectations for what personnel will be doing, you can kind of figure out, how many people you need, what percentages they'll be working at. And salaries and wages can be broken down into categories that describe and justify the personnel and the information for each position that's going to be needed for this project. So what you'll do is you'll provide a brief description of each individual's roles and responsibilities on the project in the budget narrative. And so the budget narrative, depending again on the template that your sponsor may require you to use, it will usually require the name of the person, their degree qualifications, their title and or role on the project, their dedicated time commitment, and then a little bit more elaboration or description of the duties and roles they plan on conducting in relation to the project. And again, be mindful of any requirements from some sponsors, such as salary caps or minimum effort and things like that. It just kind of depends on the funder. We do allow people to be 0% on grants, but it kind of depends, I think, on the situation. So just be sure to read the RFP and see if they allow that. So again, for the budget, you would want to list, the numbers that you're requesting, but in the budget narrative, you would break it down and describe exactly what each person is doing. And again, it doesn't have to be super exhaustive. Generally for each person, you might just have like a paragraph or two describing what it is that they're doing for the project. All right, so this is where it gets a little more numbersy. So there's something called percent effort, and I hope it's not as scary as it sounds. So for percent effort, essentially what we're doing is we're trying to find out, okay, so we have this person who's working on the grant. How much of their time are they going to work on this project? And how much is that going to cost, so we can figure out how much we actually need to request as far as the project goes. So there's a calculation where you take the person's whether they're full-time or part-time, the percentage of their time they'll spend on the project. So like 10%, just as an example here, we'll say one full-time person will spend 10% of their time for the duration of the project for 12 months, right? So that's how much effort they're going to put into the project. So person months is essentially the calculation of the number of months that person would be working on the project for that year. In my next slide, I'll have an example of that. But for this, I have some resources, and they're in the resource document. There is a NIH percent of time and effort to person months conversion chart. And so you can download that Excel sheet and you can type in the information and it'll convert the person effort into person months for you. There's also a link which goes a little bit deeper into what is a person month and how do I calculate it. And there's another link that's how do you convert percent effort into person months. But just as a definition, a person month is the metric for expressing the effort, the amount of time that personnel devote to a specific project. And if we go to the next slide, we'll have just a little bit. Oh, I'll be describing it in the next two slides. So essentially, it's like, why do we need to know this? Well, so we need to know this to determine and justify how much to ask for people's salaries. So I'm going to have just a general example here to kind of walk through this example. So we have fictional situation. We've got Janelle Doe. She's a library manager and a project lead. She will be responsible. And again, this is actually an example of what you would write in the budget narrative too, just like a description of what they're doing. So this person will be responsible for the overall coordination and supervision of all aspects of the project. This will include hiring, training, and supervising staff or students, scheduling and staff assignments, promotion for patron participation, and data management. In addition, she will conduct the orientation sessions, assist with survey evaluation, and be responsible for reporting the project's findings. So here we've got our little narrative that would go in the budget justification or the budget narrative. Sorry, I use those terms interchangeably. I should stop there. Budget narrative and budget justification are just two different terms for the same thing. It's the written portion of the budget where you're justifying what's on the actual spreadsheet. All right, so we have Janelle. So Janelle will spend 12 calendar months on the project. She's spending a year on the project at 20% of her effort. And that's something that we've decided on after, much deliberation. She'll spend 20% of her time on this project. So Janelle earns $66,000 annually. So we need that information. We need to know how much she earns, what percent of time that she will be working on the project, and for how long, in order to do the calculation. So the calculation we would do for the budget justification and the budget is she will work for 12 months. She's a full-time person and she'll be working at 20%. So using the resources from the last slide, you would discover that that amounts to 2.4 person months. So the reason we need that information is because we need to calculate how much 2.4 months would be of her annual salary. So when we do the calculation, 2.4 months of her annual salary equals to $13,200. So that amount is the amount that we would be requesting on our program proposal. We would be requesting the $13,000 amount because we're only utilizing 20% of Janelle's time. And again, like we talked about earlier, we only want to request a proportionate amount of what is actually being used for the project. So for Janelle, she's not spending 100% of her time on the project. So we can't charge 100% of her salary, right? We can only charge the percentage that she's working, the effort. So in grant terminology, we use the term effort, which basically just means the amount of time that they're working on this project. So that would go under as project salary support. That would be just the direct cost for her salary. But digging a little deeper onto the next slide, there's another budget category that's called fringe benefits. So fringe benefits are allowances, services, and programs that are provided by employers as additional compensation to regular salary and wages. So whenever you are adding personnel to a project, you will often also want to include not just their salary and wages percent effort amount, but you'll also want to add percentages for fringe. And again, fringe will vary by organization. So this number will actually depend on your organization's fringe rates. And some example of what fringe covers or what it is it covers things like sick leave, vacation leave, insurance, retirement and pension plans, unemployment, tuition reimbursement programs, and the list kind of goes on. And so at the proposal stage, sometimes you may not know off the top of your head what the fringe rate may be, or what often happens is fringe rate will vary depending on the person's working status. So if they're full-time versus half-time versus, a reduced amount of time, they might have a different rate. So what often happens is your organization will have different rates depending on the staff's full-time or part-time position. So for these examples, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use our university's rates, and I'll just use that for our examples. So you can kind of see an example of what rates would look like. But again, for your proposal, you wouldn't necessarily use these figures. You would need to figure out what the numbers are for your university. So going on to the next slide. All right, so here is a fringe rate example. Let's see. Yes. So Trace, if you want to look up those links that I listed, it should help figure out the percent of effort time. But yes, it should be calculated out of the percentage of your work hours. So for our institution, we tend to just assume that people have a 40-hour work week. But if that's any different, like say if you have someone who's part-time who's working 20 hours a week and they're only working maybe 2 hours a week on the project, then that would be 10% of their time. So really it's dependent on that individual's set time. And I can answer more questions about that in detail if you want to email me about how those specific rates are. But it's basically like just to generalize it, it depends on that person's status. So if they're, if they only work 20 weeks, then the percentages of that, if they work 40 hours, then the percentage is based off of that. All right, so some fringe benefit examples. So the HSE fringe rate is 23% for faculty, 33% for staff, and 8.65% for student and part-time employees. And so there's a pooled average, and then there's the averages for each category. So what we would do for a proposal is we would say, okay, we'll just say Janelle is faculty here. Her fringe rate will be calculated 23%. And again, this will vary. The percentages will vary by your institution. So you would need to consult with your organization to see what your own particular fringe rates are. But for this example case, we'll say, okay, it's 23%. So we would find out what the percentage of 23% is only the amount that we requested. So we're requesting 13,200 of salary support for Janelle because she's only working 20% on this project for a year. And so we multiply that by the 23% and we get about $3,000 of estimated fringe. So what you would do is the count towards a project total so far for Janelle's salary and fringe is actually $16,236 because we are adding her salary plus her fringe. And both of those categories are actually considered direct costs because they are costs that we can easily identify. And so again, building Janelle's project here, we now have her salary and her fringe percent, and you would do this for each staff member. So for the sake of ease, we are just covering one person, but of course you would do this for each of the personnel that are listed in the grant project. All right, next slide. Okay, so some budget building things to consider before we get to our overall example. Think about what is the maximum amount of funds that I am able to apply for. So like we mentioned earlier, for our funding, you can request IDC, but you cannot go over the total amount of the award when you add your direct costs and your IDC together. So make sure that whenever you add those two numbers together, you're still up to or under the total amount for the award. What is the budget period I am budgeting for? So again, the amount of time that the budget will last is pretty important for all those math calculations that we did earlier. And then are there any restrictions associated with this opportunity? So again, we talked about, what are allocable and allowable costs. And so making sure that the costs you're requesting aren't on that list of unallowable costs for that project. And then would I be able to do this project with the funds being offered? So making sure that, that you're not coming in over budget, but also not coming in under budget. Because that happens sometimes too, where you really want to get the award and people might overpromise what they can do. And the funder isn't necessarily looking for anyone to overpromise what they're doing. They want them to be able to complete what they had said they were going to do with the funding award amount that's being offered. So just kind of making sure that the project scope is reasonable also compared to the budget being requested for. All right. Okay, so I said I would talk about travel. So travel is an interesting category. Funds can be allocated to travel to facilitate collaboration or whatever may be necessary to meet the aims and objectives of this project. In our case, since we're an outreach office, we often used it as a means of connecting with people, conducting site visits, conducting presentations at conferences, introducing ourselves to different partners, and maybe just, in these cases with health information projects, just helping to take ideas into different realms or areas or places. So it's important just to note that different types of grants will have different policies about travel. Some will allow travel, some will not. Some will permit domestic travel, but they won't necessarily allow international travel. So again, you'll need to check with the funder in the funding announcement guide. But for our purposes, we do allow travel, domestic travel, and we can, we will usually use the GSA rates. Again, in the resources guide, there's a link to gsa.gov. You'll have to go up to the top and click on the travel tab at the top, and it'll give you like a little search page in which you can look up different locations. So generally the GSA rates will go by geographic location. And so say like if you're going to Austin, Texas, you would type in Austin, Texas, and that'll give you a listing of per diem rates, which is for meals. And it'll also give you a listing of lodging rates of how much the rates will be to cover staying at a hotel and things like that. So for travel, make sure that you take into consideration any of the restrictions, and then of course we always need to justify it. So again, going back to the budget narrative example, you'll list $2,000 in the actual spreadsheet budget, but then in the budget justification or narrative, you'll write something like Janelle Doe requests $2,000 for domestic travel support for up to one trip to present at a professional conference and present our findings associated with the project. $2,000 is requested for the trip to a location that, if you know where it is, you can list that, or if it's to be determined, you can also just say that is to be determined. And so you would say, $2,000 is being requested, but each travel would need to be listed, and it would need to have some sort of description or justification as to why that travel is important to the project and what you're aiming to do or achieve with that travel for the project. So it could be more than one trip. I just had one trip for an example just because it added up for this example, but you can always do more than one trip. It just needs to be well justified. All right. Now we have other direct costs, which is a separate budget category. So this can cover consulting, materials and supplies, publications, and perhaps other direct costs that don't have a standard budget category. And so to expand on that a little bit, next slide, please. There we go. So materials and supplies, you could say something like, we are including the project costs of laboratory and other project-specific supply items, like software programs, and other items that cost less than $5,000. To note, an item that costs less than $5,000 is a material and supply, not equipment. Those are actually two different categories. Our funds don't generally go to equipment because that's more of a research thing. So a researcher might need to order some very large research equipment for the lab that would easily cost over $5,000. And so they would probably have equipment listed in their budget. For our purposes, most of the time, what's being requested are, software programs or like paper materials and things like that that are less than $5,000. So that would be considered materials and supplies. Publication costs could also be included. Requesting funds for the publication of the results of the project and the preparation of those presentations and posters. So you could say something like requesting up to $1,000 for publication support in order to publish the findings of this project, of the outcome of this project in a, such and such journal. And of course, these are just made up numbers. You would, of course, need to perhaps provide some like vendor amounts. So if you've gone to a couple vendors and seen how much it would cost. And then computer services, they list a prorated share of the cost of, you could share a list of a prorated share of the cost of operating and maintaining department facilities. So this one's a little more difficult, but you can perhaps consult with your IT or with your Office of Research or whoever runs your technical equipment and see if they have any established numbers or rates of how much you should input if you're requesting computers and things like that. And the computers are a little bit tricky because often if you're buying a computer with grant funds, the expectation is that you would only use that computer for that funds. And that is something that's how our university interprets it. Different organizations might interpret that a little bit differently. But you can also request things like software. Software might be needed to maintain accurate records. You might have some survey tools that you'll be using for your project. And so you can say, we request up to this much for software support. And I just realized I am running out of time. So I'm going to go ahead and try to go over this part a little bit quickly. So now that we've gone through all the different sections, we're saying, okay, so Janelle, the Janelle Doe project. So here's your simplified project. So we're building a project up to a $25K award, and that's about the amount of our health information outreach award. And so we worked on it. And of course, in a regular project, you would probably have more people, but just for the sake of simplicity, we just use one person. We have her salaries and wages. We have her fringe that we calculated. Then we have the travel that she's going to do. We have her materials and supplies, her publication costs, the computer services she requested, and the other direct costs. We add it all up together and we get a total direct cost of $22,686. We're going to say that Janelle doesn't have a negotiated rate, so she's using the de minimis rate of 10%. So we get the number for that. And once you add the total direct costs and the IDC rate, we then come up with a total of what we're requesting, which is $24,954. So that's an example of trying to utilize as much as possible to hit the total award amount, but not go over. So any more than that, we would probably be going over. And again, you'll need to look at your IDC rate specifically to see, once you add the IDC rate to your direct costs, that it doesn't go over the total amount. All right. So I can already feel my colleagues kicking me out the door. All right, next slide. Some last things to consider, and basically just, have these 4 thoughts in mind. Important questions to ask about your budget. Are the requested costs allowable per the regulations of the funder? Are the costs proportionately allocated for the work? If someone's only working 20% on this project, we're only charging 20% of what they're working on. Are the requested expenses reasonable? Do we get a couple of funder amounts and see if the price is an average and fair price for the good that we're getting. And then is it realistic? Is the budgeted amounts that we're asking for realistic to complete the project? And is the time in the budget requested realistic? All right, so last 2 slides, and then I'll pass it back off to Brandon. Try recreating your spreadsheet budget solely based on reading the budget narrative, and then have someone else try it too. And Jen mentioned that earlier too with a proposal. It can often help to have someone else look over what you've written and be able to point out any missing gaps, because when you're writing something, you really just start to your project really well, and you might miss where you've not necessarily mentioned some information. And then I'll just skip on ahead to the last slide. Thank you. So budgets can be tricky, so don't be afraid to ask your funders for a question, I guess will be my last statement. And now that we've covered budgets, I'm going to pass it off now to Brandon. So something that is important for federal grants and our funding opportunities is to make sure that the resources we create are accessible. And so Brandon will speak now on what accessibility is and why that is important. So take it away, Brandon.
Thank you, Debbie. And no worries, I know that budget can be a lot. So in this last portion of the presentation, we'll address why accessibility matters. And before we get started, please enter why accessibility is important to you in the chat. Next slide, please. So if we look at accessibility on a worldwide scale, we will see that over 1 billion people live with some form of disability. The number of people with disabilities is dramatically increasing. This is due to the demographic trends and increases in chronic health conditions, among other causes. According to the CDC, 1 in 4 adults in the United States have some type of disability. The percentage of people living with disabilities is highest in the South. Almost everyone is likely to experience some form of disability, temporary or permanent, at some point in life. So in 1998, Congress amended the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 to require federal agencies to make their electronic and information technology accessible to people with disabilities. The law applies to all federal agencies when they develop, procure, maintain, or use electronic and information technology. Under Section 508, agencies must give disabled employees and members of the public access to information comparable to access available to others. 508 compliance is important when it comes to identifying web accessibility and disabilities such as auditory, cognitive, learning, neurological, physical, and visual. Auditory disabilities are a condition affecting the ability to understand speech. Some people with auditory disabilities can hear sounds, but sometimes not sufficiently enough to understand all speech, especially when there is background noise. This can include people using hearing aids. For some people with auditory disabilities, sign language is the primary language, and they may not read the written language as fluently. Providing important information in sign language and using simple text that is supplemented by images, graphs, and other illustrations help make web content more understandable to many people. However, it is important to remember that not all people with auditory disabilities know sign language. Cognitive learning and neurological disabilities include neurodiversity and neurological disorders, as well as behavioral and mental health disorders that are not necessarily neurological. Examples of people with cognitive learning and neurological are long passages of text without images, graphs, or other illustrations to highlight the context, web pages that are difficult to navigate, and web browsers and media players do not provide mechanisms to suppress animations and audio. Physical disability is a condition that limits one or more basic activities in life. Examples of barriers for people with disabilities are missing visual and non-visual orientation cues, page structure and other navigational aids, and insufficient time limits to respond or to complete tasks, such as to fill out online forms. Next slide, please. Visual disability is a condition when an individual partially or fully loses their ability to see. Examples of barriers for people with visual disabilities are websites, web browsers, and authoring tools that do not support the use of custom color combinations, text, images, and page layouts that cannot be resized or that lose information when resized, and website, web browsers, and authoring tools that do not provide full keyboard support. There are resources available that can assist you with 508 compliances. Section 508.gov provides guidance to federal agency staff who play a role in IT accessibility. The site addresses several key topics, including policy management, acquisition, and content creation. Next slide, please. Digital.gov's mission is to transform how Digital.gov mission is to transform how government learns, builds, delivers, and measures digital services. They do this by providing people in the federal government with the tools, methods, practices, and policy guidance they need to deliver effective and accessible digital services. So, are there any questions? Thank you so much for attending today's webinar. It's been a pleasure to teach this course with Jen, Debbie, and Margie, and we hope you picked up some valuable resources. And now we have confidence now that you have confidence to apply for grant funding. Now we would like to give you the chance to ask us some questions.
Just go ahead and feel free to pop those in the chat. We just have a few minutes, and then we will give you some more information that will help you claim your CE.
And remember, if you do have any questions, always reach out to us. Even after the webinar, we'd love to help you. Membership is for organizations. It's free to become a member. If you just go to NNLM.gov and you'll see membership on the top section, you can learn more about how to apply, or send me an email. I'm Jen Ortiz, and I can walk you through the process.
So there was a question, is there a max amount for publication costs to make an article open access? A recent article processing fee was $4K. Well, we won't be covering that information we didn't cover that information in today's presentation. But if you want to reach out to one of us, maybe we can help you find the answer to that.
Yes, and Brandon will be mentioning this later, but we actually do have a webinar coming up, and he'll give you the specific date and time. That's simply a budget workshop, because we understand that the budgets tend to be the more complicated part of the process. Well, the whole process can be a little bit complicated. But again, we'll have another webinar coming up, which will be the budget workshop, and we'll essentially have more time to just focus on questions around budgets.
There's one more question there, Debbie, that you might be able to address. Can we use additional funding from other funders to complement the NNLM award? Would we need to add it in the budget?
So what you can do is if you have like a larger project, there can be a component, and that component can be the program that NNLM funds. It would just need to be written clearly in the proposal that that's what's being done.
Thanks for watching. This video was produced by the network of the National Library of Medicine. Select the circular channel icon to subscribe to our channel, or select a video thumbnail to watch another video from the channel.